Hey everyone, welcome back to the show, and today we're diving deep into a conflict that I think many associate with grainy CNN footage and, well, maybe even some early video games. Operation Desert Storm, those night vision green images of the Gulf War. We're going way beyond that today.
Yeah, it's interesting how Desert Storm occupies this weird space in our collective memory, right? It feels both kind of distant, almost like a Nintendo war, as some called it. And yet when you look closer, it feels eerily relevant to the conflicts we see unfolding today. You know what I mean?
Totally. Like, on the one hand, it was supposed to be this new era of warfare. Swift, surgical, decisive. But then, you gotta ask, did it actually deliver on that promise? Or did it just create a whole new set of problems that we're, well, still dealing with today? But let's rewind for a second, go back to the beginning. August 2nd, 1990. Saddam Hussein, in a move that pretty much shocked the world, sends Iraqi forces pouring across the border into Kuwait.
And it's important to remember this wasn't just about some land grab. Hussein had been stewing in this for years, right? He felt that Kuwait was manipulating oil prices, holding him back economically. Plus, there were those lingering debts from the Iran-Iraq war, so grabbing Kuwait's oil fields. That was his way of resetting the board.
High risk, high reward. But the world wasn't going to let that stand. And suddenly, it wasn't just Iraq versus Kuwait anymore. This thing blew up into an international crisis.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where it gets really interesting because the UN steps in, condemns the invasion, right? Sanctions start hitting Iraq hard. And then you see this coalition coming together, the likes of which we hadn't really seen before, It becomes this whole thing about drawing a line in the sand against this kind of aggression. It wasn't just about oil or borders anymore.
Yeah, and that line kind of leads to Operation Desert Shield, which, I gotta say, sounds way more peaceful than what was actually going down. Hundreds of thousands of troops, ships, aircraft, all converging on Saudi Arabia.
It was this crazy buildup, a real show of force meant to make Hussein back down. But it also revealed something else, something really crucial at the time. You see, the specter of Vietnam was hanging over the U.S. There was this real determination to avoid another quagmire, another prolonged conflict that would erode public support. This time, it had to be different.
So, did it work?
Yeah.
Did all that muscle flexing make Hussein blink?
Not a chance. In fact, he doubled down, dug in his heels, and, well, that set the stage for what would become Operation Desert Storm.
And on January 16th, 1991, I feel like the whole world held its breath as those first bombs started falling on Baghdad. 6 weeks of intense airstrikes, followed by a ground offensive that lasted, 100 hours? And then silence. Iraq was routed, Kuwait was liberated, mission accomplished, right?
Well, that's where the narrative starts to get a little complicated, doesn't it? On the surface, yeah, it looked like a textbook victory almost, this new era of limited war in action. But if you look closer, there are all these deeper questions just lingering under the surface. Did this approach, this very surgical approach to war, actually address the root causes of the conflict? Or did it just, pave the way for even more instability down the road?
It's like solving one problem by creating a whole new set of dilemmas. And all those dilemmas played out on this global stage, broadcast into living rooms around the world in a way that we hadn't really seen before. I mean, this wasn't just a war. It was like a 24/7 media spectacle, especially with CNN's around-the-clock coverage.
Absolutely. And that constant media presence had this incredible impact on how we as a global audience understood the conflict, right? For a lot of people, those flickering images of smart bombs and night vision, that was their introduction to modern warfare. It was both mesmerizing and, well, more than a little unsettling, I think.
For sure. But this impact, it wasn't just confined to the evening news, right? Even Hollywood couldn't resist the pull of this whole video game war thing.
It's true, but it wasn't just about churning out action flicks either. Films like Courage Under Fire, Three Kings, these movies really dug into the complexities of what they saw. The human cost of war, the moral gray areas. They weren't afraid to ask some really tough questions about the nature of war and victory, even in the face of what seemed like this, cut and dried victory.
So on the one hand, you have this model war, but then on the other, it triggers this wave of films questioning the very idea of a model war. It's kind of a paradox, isn't it?
It really is, and I think it speaks to this really fascinating and kind of uncomfortable aspect of Desert Storm's legacy. It has this way of raising more questions than it answers. We see it in how the media covered it. We see it reflected in the arts. And as we'll explore further, it's still shaping how we think about and wage war even today. It's funny you should mention those films questioning a model war, because even the way Desert Storm was fought, the tech they were using, it seemed to bring up as many questions as it answered. I mean, this was the first war where satellite imagery played a major role in planning and, actually fighting the war.
Oh, yeah. Now that you mention it, I remember all the talk about smart bombs back then. Suddenly, we were able to hit a target from miles away with, like, pinpoint accuracy. It's like something out of Star Wars. But did that change things? I mean, did it make warfare too, I don't know, too clean, too easy to watch on TV, not feel the real weight of it?
I think those are questions that honestly we're still grappling with today. And it wasn't just the technology, right? The coalition itself was this really fascinating mix of over 30 countries. You had Western powers fighting alongside Arab nations, all united against Hussein. It's pretty wild when you think about it, a level of international cooperation we just haven't seen on that scale since Desert Storm.
Makes you wonder what the real glue was that held it all together, right? Was it simply about condemning the invasion? Or were there other, geopolitical plates spinning underneath it all? And honestly, could that kind of coalition even happen today with all the, the complexities of the world now?
That's what I mean about Desert Storm being this sort of benchmark, right? This point of reference whenever we talk about interventionism. And it's not even just about the why of intervention, it's the how that gets really tricky too. This whole thing about minimizing casualties, military and civilian, achieving a swift victory, and then, just as importantly, getting out. That whole playbook, it all kind of stems from Desert Storm. At least that's how a lot of people saw it.
Which brings us back to that phrase we keep hearing, limited war. We've talked about the appeal, right?
Yeah.
Decisive strike, minimal casualties, clear exit strategy. But when you look at Desert Storm, did it really live up to that ideal? Did anyone actually stop to think about the long game, the consequences down the road?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where things get a little murky. Because, the military campaign, it was fast, it was decisive, no question. But the aftermath tells a different story.
Right, it's like we can't just isolate those few weeks of fighting and ignore everything else. The sanctions that crippled Iraq, the instability that followed, the rise of new tensions in the region, that's all part of Desert Storm's story too.
100%. And, those long-term consequences, those unintended ripple effects, they kind of force us to face a really uncomfortable truth, and that is there's no such thing as a clean war. Even with the best intentions, the most advanced weapons, overwhelming force, there are always going to be costs. Costs that we see, costs that remain hidden, costs that we feel right away, and costs that don't show up for years, even decades.
And those costs, especially the ones that stay hidden, they don't always get the same attention as those immediate military objectives, do they? Makes you think about all the other factors in the mix.
Yeah.
Political agendas, economic interests, the way the media shapes the story and all.
You hit the nail on the head. That's what I think makes Desert Storm such a fascinating case study. It forces us to move beyond those easy narratives, the good guys versus bad guys stories, the simple win-loss columns. It makes us grapple with the real messiness of conflict, the ethical dilemmas, the curveballs that no one sees coming, and those things have a way of overshadowing even the most well-planned interventions.
And one of those curveballs, maybe one of the biggest and most controversial legacies come out of Desert Storm, is this whole debate about humanitarian intervention, right? If we see atrocities happening, if we have the power to step in, do we have a moral obligation to do something, even if it means using military force?
It's a question that has been around forever, But Desert Storm, I think it really brought that tension into focus. And honestly, there's no easy answer. I mean, on the one hand, standing by and watching while terrible things happen, that feels wrong on a fundamental level. But on the other, history is full of these cautionary tales, interventions that went sideways, where the cure was worse than the disease.
It's like this impossible balancing act, right? Trying to weigh the responsibility to protect against the risks of making things worse.
Mm-hmm.
And finding that balance, that sweet spot, I feel like that's something we're still struggling with, even today.
We are. Every time there's a new crisis, a new humanitarian disaster, a new situation where intervention is on the table, the ghost of Desert Storm is right there in the room, reminding us of both the potential and the very real dangers of military action. And that debate, trust me, it's not going away anytime soon.
And that debate, all those ethical complexities, they didn't just stay locked in some academic ivory tower or some political debate chamber, did they? I mean, the stuff bled into pop culture, too.
No.
Even something as specific as, the Highway of Death became this huge flashpoint.
Oh, yeah, the Highway of Death. It's a stark reminder that even in what's framed as a decisive victory, war is brutal. Those images of bombed-out vehicles, just the sheer scale of destruction, it really forced a lot of people to ask themselves some hard questions. Questions about using the right amount of force, what the rules of engagement should be, even when a ceasefire is already in effect.
Hold on. For those who might not know the term, could you break down what proportionality of force actually means in this context, in the context of war?
Sure. It's basically this principle in international law that says the force you use in a conflict should be in line with the military objective. Don't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Basically, it's about avoiding unnecessary force, unnecessary suffering, and making sure the response fits the threat.
So when we talk about something like the highway of death, suddenly you have these questions popping up. Was the amount of force justified in that moment? Was it over the top given the circumstances? And those questions get even thornier when you factor in, reports of civilian casualties, families trying to flee the conflict who just got caught in the crossfire.
Absolutely. And it gets to the heart of this tension that's always there when we talk about war and intervention. How do you reconcile the need to act decisively with this equally important need to minimize harm, especially to civilians who are not involved in the fighting? How do you balance the desire to end a conflict quickly with the potential for creating more problems down the line?
These are tough questions, and like you said earlier, there are no easy answers. But we gotta ask them, right? Because ignoring the past is a pretty surefire way to repeat it.
100%. And that's exactly why it's so important to revisit events like Desert Storm. It's not just about looking back at history. It's about understanding how those events are still shaping the world we live in today, how we think about conflict, our role in a world where everything is connected, and how to navigate this landscape where things can change in an instant.
It's kind of wild, right? When we think of Desert Storm, we picture those grainy night vision images, hear those sound bites about a bloodless war. But like we've been talking about, it's so much more complicated than that. Those 6 weeks in the desert, it's like they opened up this Pandora's box of ethical and strategic questions that we haven't been able to close since.
It really is this weird turning point in history. Desert Storm, on the one hand, it seemed to confirm some of those ideas about modern warfare, the power of technology, this desire for quick and decisive victories. But then at the same time, it revealed just how limited those ideas really are, how messy things get when you're dealing with the real world. There are always things you can't plan for no matter how hard you try.
Yeah, like that whole dilemma of wanting to do something to step in and prevent atrocities, but then knowing there's a very real chance you might actually make things worse.
Okay.
So did Desert Storm actually give us any clear answers about that, or did it just, muddy the waters even more?
Honestly, I think it did both. On the one hand, seeing that coalition come together, the clarity of the mission, it kind of reinforced this idea that intervention, when done right, could actually work. Gave people hope, maybe even a naive hope, that military force could be used as this tool for good, for building a better world.
On the other hand,
Well, the other hand is that it showed us, in pretty stark terms, just how easily those interventions can go wrong, how messy and unpredictable they can be, the long-term consequences, those ripple effects that no one sees coming. Those were lessons learned the hard way, both in the immediate aftermath and then in the years that followed.
it's like we went in expecting this clean break, right? Thinking a decisive victory would solve everything. But instead, well, we got the world we live in now, don't we? A world where those same debates about when to intervene, when to use force, how far is too far.
Yeah.
Those questions just keep popping up over and over again.
Exactly. I mean, look at the conversations happening right now. Just pick a topic, right?
Yeah.
Syria, Ukraine, the rise of global terrorism. Each of those crises, in its own way, forces us to think about Desert Storm, to ask ourselves if we actually learned anything from it.
So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to take away from all this? Are there even, any right answers when it comes to these big, messy questions?
If there were, I think the world would be a very different place. No, I think the real lesson here, if there is one, is that there are no easy answers, no magic formulas. Desert Storm reminds us that war, even when it's fought with the most advanced weapons, even when it's framed as a humanitarian mission, it's always going to be messy, unpredictable, and morally complicated.
So it's not about having all the answers figured out, but about even knowing which questions to ask in the first place.
Exactly. It's about being willing to sit with the uncomfortable stuff, to challenge our own assumptions, admit that we don't have it all figured out. But most importantly, I think, it's about recognizing that the choices we make today, whether to intervene, when to use force, what our role in the world should be, those choices matter. And those choices, they have a way of echoing far beyond the battlefield, far beyond the headlines, farther than we can even imagine sometimes.
That's a lot to sit with, for sure. But I think it's something we have to think about, don't you? Because
Yeah.
if we want to build a world that's more peaceful, more just, well, that starts with looking back, understanding the mistakes, recognizing those unintended consequences, those ripple effects that shape the world we live in. So there you have it, a deep dive into Operation Desert Storm, a war that was supposed to change everything. And in many ways it did.
A conflict that might feel like ancient history to some, but when you look closer, it's got so much to teach us about war, about the promises and the perils of intervention. It really makes you think about what it means to engage with the world around us in a way that's thoughtful, that's informed.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. As we navigate this world that's more interconnected, but also feels like it's getting more volatile every day, what can we learn from conflicts like Desert Storm? More importantly, how can those lessons, those hard-won insights, guide us as we make decisions and hopefully build a future that's a little bit brighter than the past? Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep listening to those different perspectives, and keep those conversations going.